Hi everyone, welcome to my workshop. When I first got interested in woodworking, one of the first power tools that I bought was a scroll saw. Mainly because it was small and I only had a small shop. It was easy to use and immediately enabled me to start making small projects such as Christmas decorations, small boxes, and various wall hangings. Later I read an article in Scroll Saw Woodworking and Crafts magazine written by Carol Rothman on how to make wooden bowls using a scroll saw instead of a lathe. I tried the project and was so impressed that I immediately went out and bought Carol's book, Wooden Bowls from the Scroll Saw, and have been hooked on making bowls ever since. This book has since become the Bible for people making scroll saw bowls. Later, when I bought my first bandsaw, I was very pleased to discover that with a few modifications, the same techniques could also be used to make bandsaw bowls. Although I now make the majority of my bowls on my lathe, I still occasionally go back to the scroll saw to make some special bowls. So, why would you want to make bowls on using a scroll saw instead of a lathe? Well, the most obvious one is you don't own a lathe. Another one is that it only requires a single board, about 3/4 of an inch thick, 8 by 8 inches, to make a very nice bowl. This is especially nice if you're using expensive hardwoods. The other one is that you can make bowls in shapes that you just can't make on a lathe. For example, as near as I know, it is impossible to make a square bowl on a wood lathe. The theory behind scroll saw bowls is illustrated in the pictures that will appear above my shoulder. Essentially what you do is you cut a series of concentric rings from a board, working from the outside towards the inside with the saw set at a specific angle. This angle is determined by a combination of the thickness of the wood you're using, the width of the rings that you are cutting, and also the design of the bowl. You can use fancy trigonometry to calculate the angle yourself, or you can simply go to Carol Rothman's book, and she has a table in there that does all the calculations for you. The illustration here is for a bowl that consists of 3 rings and a base. Now, if you calculated your cutting angle correctly, you've done your sawing accurately, when you glue and stack all the pieces together, what you will have is you'll have a very nice bowl that with minimal sanding inside and out is ready for final finishing. The first step in making a scroll saw bowl is to either make or choose an appropriate pattern. The pattern can be as simple as drawing a series of concentric rings on your board using a compass and pencil, or especially if you want to make a more complicated bowl, going online or from a book and choosing a pattern from that. In this case, I'm going to be making a square bowl from Carol Rothman's book. Next, you want to choose an appropriate blank. The blank can consist of either a solid board, such as this, or if you want to make something a little more complicated, you can make up your own blank. In this case, I've made one up of alternating strips of cherry and walnut from scraps in my workshop. The important thing to remember is that the top and the bottom of the blank must be completely smooth. Next, what you want to do is you want to completely cover the top of your blank with painter's tape. This has 2 purposes. One is it'll make removing the pattern after you've cut the rings a lot easier. And the second one is, especially if you're using a scroll saw, it helps to lubricate the bowl. Next, you want to draw 2 intersecting lines on your bowl blank. The purpose of these lines is to make guidelines that will help you align the rings properly when you're gluing up the bowl. in this case, because I made up my board, or I laminated my board using pieces of wood, I want to make sure that this guideline that runs in this direction lines up perfectly with the join between the two middle boards. Next, what you do is that you use a repositional adhesive such as 3M Super 77 and completely coat the underside of the blank. Or I should say of the pattern. Next, you carefully line up the pattern with the guidelines on your bowl. And stick it down. In this case, because I have a laminated board, I also want to make sure that the places for my blade entry holes don't line up on this center seam. Next, what you're going to do is you're going to take and you're going to mark your blade entry holes with an awl. It just makes drilling them a little bit easier. Now you need to drill the blade entry holes for the scroll saw. This can be done using your drill press, a hand drill, or a rotary tool such as what I'm going to use. Normally I use a 1/16 inch bit. Now, in order to ensure that my blade entry holes are at the correct angle, I use a guide block that is made up of a scrap of wood with the angle that is cut on it to be the angle that I need to cut my bowls. In this case, 28 degrees. Next, what you do is you line it up with your blade entry holes. Just use the alignment tool in order to just hold everything down at the appropriate angle and then drill. Now I suggest that you try this a couple times in some scrap wood before you actually use your blank. And now the blank is all ready to be cut. If you're going to be using a bandsaw instead of a scroll saw to make your bowl, setting up the blank and pattern is a little different. Due to the continuous blade in the bandsaw, you can't insert it into the middle of the board as you would with a scroll saw pattern. Well, the solution is simple. Simply take your pattern and split it in two. You can either do this by putting the whole blank and pattern together and then cutting them down the middle, or you can do as I have done and glue them up separately. Either way, what you then do is you cut each of your half rings off on the bandsaw, and then when you're finished, you glue them back together and you end up with exactly the same rings as you would cutting them out on a scroll saw. Okay, now that we've prepared the bowl blank, it's time to set our scroll saw or bandsaw to the correct cutting angle, which in the case of this bowl is 28 degrees. There's a number of different tools we can do this. We can use a protractor set to 28 degrees. We can use the angle cutting guide that we use for drilling the blade access holes in the blank. Or, my personal favorite, we can use a digital inclinometer. No matter which method you use, the first step that you need to do is to ensure that you start with your blade at 90 degrees to the table. And it's best done with a small square. And yeah, we're right on there. So now, take the inclinometer, zero it, and start to adjust it towards 28 degrees. And there we are, 28 degrees exactly. Now, just as a check, what I normally will do is I will take my cutting guide and I'll also line it up on the blade just to ensure that everything looks right. And everything looks right. Great, we're all done. Okay, now that we have the pattern glued to the top of our bowl blank, our blade entry holes drilled, and our scroll saw table set to 28 degrees, it's time to start cutting out the rings for our bowl. A number 9 scroll saw blade with approximately 9 teeth per inch is recommended. If you've never cut on your scroll saw with your table at an angle like this, I recommend that you practice with a few pieces of scrap wood before trying to cut your bowl blank. First, we're going to trim the waste off the outside of the bowl blank. It's important to let the saw do the work. Don't force the cut. Also, try not to move the bowl up and down on this, or you're going to end up with an inaccurate cutting angle. Slow and steady works best. Okay, now that the waste is done, we remove the waste. And then what we will do is that we will mark the top edge of the bowl, just for orientation. And also remember the guidelines that we put on the bowl. What we'll now do is we will extend these guidelines all the way down the side of the bowl. Now we're ready to cut the first ring. Release the blade from the top of the scroll saw. Insert it into the blade entry hole from the back. Reattach it to the saw. Retension the blade, and now we're ready for cutting the first ring. Okay, now that the first ring is finished, what we will do is that we will again extend the guidelines from the top of the ring all the way down to the bottom of the ring on each side. We'll also take the blank and we will mark the top of the blank on there, and we will again extend the guidelines all the way down the side to the bottom. All we do is we have to cut out the second and the third ring and the base in exactly the same method as we've just done for the first ring. Just as putting together a blank for use on a bandsaw is a little different from the scroll saw, cutting it out is also a little different. For example, I find that it's much easier to work from the side of the table rather than head on, as in the scroll saw, or even when I would normally use the bandsaw. Also, I find that it is much easier to start with the center rings and work outwards rather than from the outside and work inwards. The other difference is that I find that it's actually easier to cut just slightly outside of the pattern all the way around rather than directly on the pattern. Bowl is all cut out, and I've already removed the pattern, and I've used a bit of 220 grit sandpaper to sand any of the edges for any fuzzies that there might be. The next step is to make sure that all of the rings in the bowl fit together and that there's no spaces between the rings. Easiest way to do that is to temporarily put them together and hold them in place and use a shine a light through it. If you can see any space, any light coming through between the rings, that means that your rings aren't perfectly flat. Now I'm lucky there's no spaces between my rings, but if there were, what I would do is take the rings and sand them lightly on a piece of 150 grit sandpaper that I've glued onto a sheet of plywood. I'd sand them, take them back to the light, see if there's any spaces. If there still is, take it back and repeat it. And I continue to do that until I saw no light coming through. Now what we're going to do is we're going to glue our bowl together. So we put the base aside because that'll be glued onto the bowl after we have sanded the inside of the bowl. You can use Titebond 2 or Titebond 3 glue for making bowls like this, but I prefer Weld Bond glue, mainly because it tacks much quicker than does Titebond glue. To do this, what you do is you just put some dots around your, starting with your smallest ring, spread it out evenly on the top of the ring. And you place the next largest ring on top of it, aligning all of the guidelines that you had drawn and moved down to the side of the pieces as you cut them. Carefully aligning them. Okay, when you've got everything aligned, you go on to the next piece. And you take the top piece and put it all on, and again align the pieces carefully using the guidelines that you have transferred to these pieces. Okay, when you're satisfied with the alignment, you transfer it to a bowl press. Now, you can either use a bowl press similar to this that Carol Rothman has plans for in her book, but I much prefer something a little larger and something that I use when I'm doing my other segmented bowls. Make sure that you have a piece of wax paper at the bottom so if there's any glue the bowl won't stick. Place the bowl in it. Tighten it down firmly but not too much and let it sit there for about 5 minutes. At the end of 5 minutes, what you do is you take it out and you clean up any squeeze out of the glue as best as you can. Then you put it back into the press and you let it sit until the glue dries. Normally I let my bowls sit overnight. Okay, I have finished bandsawing the blanks for our bowl. I've removed the pattern. I've used a little bit of 220 grit sandpaper to remove the fuzzies from the top edge. Now what I need to do is I need to join each of these half rings together to form a full ring. For this, I'm going to use a rub joint. For this, all that you do is you apply a little bit of glue on each side. Put the joint together, rub it back and forth until you feel it tack. And then you hold it in place for a few minutes before moving on to the next joint. So again, taking the rings, a little bit of glue on the edge, put them together, rub them until you start to feel them tack, hold in place for a few moments, and then you can put them aside to dry. Okay, the glue has dried, taking our half rings and turning them into whole rings. I've taken all the rings and the bowl base and I have sanded them smooth, top and bottom, using some 150 grit sandpaper glued to a piece of plywood. I've taken the bowl, I put it together and I've checked with a light to see if there's any light going through and didn't find any, so we're lucky. Now we're ready to glue the bowl together. As with the square bowl that we were making, I'm going to take the base and I'm going to put it aside and we'll glue that on later after we've sanded the inside and outside of the bowl. Now, unlike the square bowl, because these are half rings, to add a little bit of extra strength with the bowl, what I'm going to do is I'm going to alternate the joints. So I'm going to have the glued joints sitting at 90-degree angles to one another as we work our way up. So in this bowl, the 90-degree joint's going to run this way. This one is going to run this way. This one is going to come back. and then in the top ring we're going to be this way again. And gluing them together is exactly the same as what we did for the square bowl. The next step in making our bowl is that we need to sand the bowl inside and out to make it nice and smooth before we put on the base. Now there's a number of different ways you could do it. I guess you could do it with by hand if you really had enough elbow grease to do it, or you could use machines. One of my favorite machines to do it is a drill press. Now on the drill press you could do something like a rigid drum if you've got these. The problem with the rigid drum is that you've got to get one that is long enough to span the entire width of your project, or else you may end up sanding unevenly across it. A better alternative is an inflatable drum sander mounted on the drill press that is wide enough to take the whole width and can do inside and outside quite nicely. You could also use a small pad sander on your drill press. They're great for doing the outside and can be used on the inside depending on the size of your bowl and how your drill press is set up, but it can be a little cramped working that way. The other one that I really like for doing especially the inside of the bowls is an inflatable ball sander. And it's especially good for doing the inside of bowls in and around the corners. And it's very easy to work your way around. Important thing when you're using a drill press is that the speed should be no more than somewhere between 300 and let's say 600 RPM. If you have it running too fast, you risk actually burning the wood. Now some other alternatives are, you could use an oscillating drum sander such as this. It is the right width of it, and really you just have to flip the bowl upside down and you can do inside and outside. The problem is that it's kind of difficult and you risk sanding unevenly to the top and bottom. If you're fortunate enough to have one of the newer drum sanders that actually has an adjustable table, you could take that table and you could actually adjust it to 28 degrees. Or I guess if you have a drum sander such as mine, you could actually make your own table that's set at 28 degrees. Another great tool for doing the outside of bowls is a band sander, particularly a stationary band sander. You just run it along and it does the outside of the bowls really quickly, gives a nice smooth finish. You can also use a portable band sander, just like this, by fastening it into a vise and making it stationary in the vise. It's not ideal, but it works. Whichever tool you use depends on your personal preferences, what you have available, what works best for you. One important thing about the sanding is this is going to generate a lot of sawdust. So what you want to do is you want to have dust control measures available to you, whether that be a dust collector that's at wherever you're working, but especially either a disposable mask or a respirator mask to protect yourself from inhaling all of that dust. Okay, the bowl is all sanded on the inside. Sanded it up to 320. Now it's time to fasten on the bottom. So I just turn the bowl over, and exactly the same method as what we've used to build up the rings. Add some dabs of glue just around the rim. Want to try and minimize the amount of squeeze out so that I have less glue to clean up on the inside of the bowl. But at the same time, I want to make sure that I have a nice even coat of glue all around the outside. Need a little bit more here. Whoops. Not too worried about squeeze out on the outside of the bowl, but squeeze out on the inside is much more difficult to clean up. Now I just put the bowl on and line it up with all the guidelines. Flip it over just to make sure everything is straight. Okay. Pop it into the bowl press for a few moments, then I'll pull it out and clean up the squeeze out. And once I've cleaned up the squeeze out, we'll come back and we will sand off and finish off the outside. Okay, the insides of both the scroll saw and bandsaw blades has been finished and sanded with 320 grit sandpaper. I've glued on the bottom, and now what I need to do is smooth off the outsides of both bowls. To do this, I'm going to use a combination of my portable band sander mounted in a vise and a pad sander at the drill press for the finishing sanding. I'll sand both with 320 grit sandpaper. Once that's done, I'll then completely clean away any sawdust using a combination of a vacuum cleaner and a damp cloth, and then wipe down the insides and outsides of both bowls with some Varsol. The purpose of this is to show up any residual glue. If I do find some residual glue, I'll mark it with a little bit of chalk, let the bowl dry, and then go back in and remove that glue. I may have to do this a couple of times before I get rid of all the glue. Once this is done, both bowls will be ready for finishing. Now, what finish you use is a very personal choice. If you're looking for something quick, you could use shellac, which is recommended by Carol Rothman in her book, or you could use spray-on lacquer, which is my favorite. I find this goes on very easily, very smooth, and is available in both a gloss and semi-gloss. Or you could use spray-on or wipe-on polyurethane. The choice is up to you. The problem with all of these three is that they're film finishes, and I find that you lose the touch of wood by using it. And one of the reasons I got into woodworking is because I love the feel of wood. Another problem is that if you get any scratches or damage to the bowl with any of these film finishes, they can sometimes be difficult to repair. Instead, I've moved back to an old style finish, which not only gives a nice finish, but is also food safe. This is tried and true, and it's a combination of polymerized linseed oil and beeswax. To use it, you wipe down the inside and the outside of the bowl completely, let it sit for about an hour, and then come back with a dry cloth and completely wipe it smooth and dry. Let that sit for an additional 24 hours, and then come out and buff the complete inside and outside of the bowl with very, very fine sandpaper. I find this gives a very, very nice low sheen finish. So that's the end of making these bowls. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I hope you enjoy making these types of bowls as much as I do. Thank you for watching.